The summer of 1863 was heavy with heat and with hope. For 2 long years, the American Civil War had torn the nation apart. But now, General Robert E. Lee, commander of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, believed he could end it all. His men had fought with fierce determination through Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. They had beaten back Union armies again and again. Now Lee's eyes turned north. The plan was bold, almost reckless. He would invade the Union heartland, march through Pennsylvania, and threaten cities like Harrisburg, maybe even Philadelphia or Washington. If the North tasted war on its own soil, perhaps they would lose their will to fight. By late June, the Confederate Army, over 70,000 strong, crossed into Pennsylvania. Their boots trampled green fields instead of southern clay. Townsfolk watched from windows, frightened but curious, as gray columns marched past under fluttering flags. For Lee, this was more than a campaign. It was destiny. But destiny has a cruel sense of humor, because waiting ahead was a small Pennsylvania town, Gettysburg. And in 3 days, from July 1st to July 3rd, that quiet town would become the turning point of the entire war. The South would never rise higher than it did there, and from that peak, it would begin its long, tragic fall. But the fall didn't come in a day. It began on a quiet morning, with a handful of cavalrymen riding into a small Pennsylvania town neither army had planned to fight over. No one knew it yet, but within 3 days, this place, Gettysburg, would decide the fate of the Confederacy itself. July 1st, 1863. The morning began quietly. A few distant shots, a puff of smoke in the hills. Neither side expected a full-scale battle. Confederate General Henry Heth had sent a few brigades into Gettysburg, supposedly to search for supplies, but what they found were Union cavalry under General John Buford, dug in, waiting. Gunfire echoed through the valleys. The battle had begun almost by accident. By afternoon, Confederate reinforcements arrived, pushing Union forces back through the town. The blue lines bent and broke. Union soldiers retreated in chaos, running through narrow streets under fire. To many Confederate officers, victory on day 1 seemed certain. But here came the first great blunder. The Union Army, in retreat, fell back to the hills south of town, Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and Little Round Top. Those heights formed a natural fortress. A defensive line curving like a fishhook. General Richard Ewell, commanding the Confederate Second Corps, had the chance to take those hills before the Union dug in. Lee's message was simple: take the ground if practicable, but Ewell hesitated. Maybe he feared a counterattack. Maybe his troops were exhausted. Maybe the wording, if practicable, gave him too much room for doubt. Whatever the reason, the moment passed. By nightfall, Union troops had occupied the high ground and fortified it. Artillery rolled into position. Trenches were dug. And as the moon rose, Lee's army found itself staring up at an enemy now holding the superior position. A single decision, a moment of hesitation, had turned advantage into disaster. From this point on, the Confederates would be attacking uphill. The next morning, July 2nd, dawned hot and silent. The fields glistened with dew, and smoke still hung in the air. General Lee, standing beside his horse traveler, studied the ridge through his spyglass. The Union Army now occupied a strong defensive arc, but Lee believed he could still break it, if he struck fast and hard. He ordered his most trusted corps commander, General James Longstreet, to attack the Union's left flank. But here, the second great blunder began to unfold. Longstreet disagreed with the plan. He wanted to maneuver around the Union line, not charge directly into it. He believed a defensive battle would favor the Confederates. But Lee insisted, "The enemy is there, and I am going to attack him there." The argument cost time. Longstreet's men didn't begin their march until afternoon. They moved slowly, trying to stay hidden from Union eyes. The heat was brutal. Dust choked the air. By the time they reached their attack position, the Union had already strengthened their flank. When the assault finally began, around 4 p.m., the fields erupted in chaos. The fighting at the wheat field, the peach orchard, and Devil's Den became some of the bloodiest of the entire war. Men charged through orchards soaked with blood. Cannon fire shredded ranks in seconds. Little Round Top, a rocky hill at the Union's far left, became the key. Union Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, leading the 20th Maine, held that hill against repeated Confederate attacks. When his men ran out of ammunition, he ordered a bayonet charge that drove the attackers back down the slope. That single act, desperate and brave, helped save the Union line. By nightfall, the Confederate assault had failed. Lee's belief in the invincibility of his army had led them straight into a wall of iron and gunfire, and still, he refused to believe the battle was lost. July 3rd dawned with thunderclouds gathering overhead. The fields were littered with the dead from the previous day. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, sweat, and death. Lee was determined to strike again, this time at the Union Center on Cemetery Ridge. He believed the Union lines were weakest there. If he could pierce through, he could split the enemy army in two. His men were exhausted, but loyal. Among them was General George Pickett, a tall, proud officer commanding fresh Virginia troops. Lee ordered him to lead the assault. Before noon, Confederate artillery opened fire, one of the largest barrages of the entire war. For nearly 2 hours, cannons thundered across the valley, shaking the earth. But most of the shells overshot their targets. The Union guns remained intact. Then around 3 p.m., the cannon fire stopped. A sudden, terrible silence fell. Then came the order. Forward, march, 15,000. Confederate soldiers stepped out of the trees and began crossing the open field toward the Union lines, nearly a mile of exposed ground. Union artillery waited in silence until the Confederates reached halfway. Then the sky erupted, shells tore through ranks. Men fell in waves. The air was filled with the whistling of iron and the screams of the dying. Still, they marched on. Pickett's men reached the stone wall at Cemetery Ridge, clashing hand to hand with Union defenders. But it was hopeless. Within half an hour, the assault collapsed. When Pickett rode back, Lee met him with solemn eyes. "General, you must look to your division." Pickett's reply was quiet. "General Lee, I have no division." More than half his men were dead or wounded. It was not just a failed attack. It was a massacre, and with it, the fate of the Confederate Army at Gettysburg was sealed. War isn't just about courage, it's about rhythm. And at Gettysburg, that rhythm broke. Lee's army moved like three great tides, led by Longstreet, A.P. Hill, and Ewell, but they never crashed together. Each corps fought bravely, yet separately, like scattered storms instead of one roaring wave. Longstreet, Lee's most trusted lieutenant, was a soldier who preferred patience over passion. He wanted to fight defensively, to pull the Union army into a trap. But Lee believed victory still favored the bold. He wanted to strike, and strike now. That difference in vision created delay. Longstreet's men didn't attack until the afternoon of July 2nd. By then, the Union Army had already shifted troops and strengthened its lines. Messages between corps arrived late or not at all. Smoke, chaos, and distance turned simple orders into confusion. A.P. Hill's men attacked too early. Ewell's divisions moved too late. And when their assaults finally began, they didn't align, like instruments playing the same tune in different tempos. Each attack hit the Union line alone, giving General Meade precious time to reinforce and redirect. While one Confederate corps bled in the fields of the Peach Orchard, another was still forming ranks miles away. It wasn't that the Confederates lacked bravery, far from it. But bravery without coordination becomes sacrifice. At Gettysburg, every corps fought its own battle. And together, those scattered battles became a single, tragic symphony of miscommunication. Had the timing been perfect, had all three corps struck in unison, the Union lines might have buckled. But war rarely grants perfection, and at Gettysburg that imperfection cost Lee the field. By the third day, even the bravest hearts were running on empty. Lee's army had marched for weeks across hundreds of miles, living off the land, fighting skirmishes all the way. They were deep in enemy territory, far from home, far from supply. Men slept on wet ground, their boots worn thin, their canteens nearly dry. The July sun showed no mercy. The air shimmered with heat. The smell of gunpowder and sweat hung heavy, and the wounded moaned through the night. Every step, every shot came slower now. Muscles trembled, minds dulled, tempers frayed. And yet, Lee still demanded one final push. On July 3rd, when he ordered Pickett's charge, his men obeyed without hesitation. But many could barely stand. let alone charge across an open field under cannon fire. Their uniforms were torn, their stomachs empty, their faces pale from exhaustion. The Confederates were not beaten in spirit, they were beaten in strength. Overextension had drained them long before the first shot of that last charge was fired. Their supply wagons lagged miles behind. Ammunition was short, communication was slow, and as Lee's army struggled to maintain formation, the Union Army, fighting on home soil, was well-fed, well-supplied, and ready. When the Confederate lines broke under the weight of Union guns, it wasn't just a tactical failure, it was physical collapse. The human body can endure only so much, and these soldiers had given everything long before the final order. By dusk, the fields were silent. Thousands of men lay scattered across the grass, too tired to fight, too wounded to move, too far from home to ever return. The invasion of the North was over, and with it, the Confederacy's last true chance at victory. On the night of July 4th, as fireworks celebrated Independence Day in the North, Lee's army began to retreat south through the rain. Wagons filled with wounded men stretched for miles. Horses sank in the mud. The air was heavy with defeat. Lee took full responsibility, telling his officers, "It is all my fault." But deep down, he knew the truth. The fault was shared among men, moments, and fate itself. Gettysburg marked the turning of the tide. From then on, the Confederate Army would never again take the offensive on such a scale. 2 years later, Lee would surrender at Appomattox. The dream of Southern independence, born in defiance, died on the fields of Pennsylvania. Today, the fields of Gettysburg are quiet. Wildflowers grow where cannons once thundered. Tourists walk the same ridges where soldiers fell. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The echo of drums, the distant shout of men charging across the open ground. Gettysburg wasn't just a battle of armies. It was a battle of judgment, pride, and the limits of human will. Lee's genius had carried him far, but at Gettysburg, it met its match. Not in the strength of the enemy alone, but in the weight of his own decisions. The 5 blunders of Gettysburg are remembered not merely as mistakes, but as lessons. That courage without caution can become folly, that confidence without clarity can lead to ruin, and that in war, as in life, one moment of hesitation can change everything.